Okay, video 2 with a whole range of other things for your exam. So, first of all, you may get a question that asks you to evaluate the possible effectiveness of budgetary policy as a means of reducing unemployment. Now, most of the time you would refer to this as a general question where you would be focusing on the strengths and weaknesses of budgetary policy with providing some overall conclusion. The other way you can target questions, specifically if you're asked for a specific policy in the strengths and weaknesses, is to focus, really hone in on a specific policy. So if we're looking at it for income taxes, for example, if you're evaluating the effectiveness of income taxes, you start with the benefits and then move on to the weaknesses to provide an overall idea of how effective income tax cuts may be in trying to increase unemployment or reduce unemployment, So in terms of the benefits, look, start off your answer by focusing on both the strengths and, the demand and the supply side link. So from a demand perspective, lower income taxes help to boost consumption. That will flow on to increase production and lead to increased real GDP, which will increase the derived demand for workers. From a supply side point of view, you can have benefits in terms of increasing participation because there's more incentive to work. That can help to increase pressures, increase competition, reduce wage pressures, can also boost productivity, and that can all lead to more international competitiveness, as well as increasing firms' willingness to supply. So focus on those benefits. Other benefits include the short impact lag that it would have, would be another thing you could focus on there when you're looking at the overall benefits of budgetary policy. And then you want to talk about the weaknesses, and the majority of your answer would be why income taxes may not be effective. So within that, there's a range of things you can talk about. You can focus on the implementation lag and how income tax cuts, like any government or budgetary policy initiative, can take a long time to get through the houses, the House of Representatives and the Senate, and may face political objections. Other things you could talk about is that income tax cuts may not lead to more spending. If confidence is weak and we're in a trough, for example, they may not spend the extra money. Also, even if they do spend the money, businesses may respond by increasing workers' hours. So again, this is a chance to link it to what's happening in the economy at the moment. So the high levels of underemployment mean that firms may not actually hire more workers, which would reduce unemployment. They may just increase the hours of their existing workers as a way to respond to the extra demand. Other issues could occur that, for example, it could lead to budget deficits, which is not only goes against fiscal consolidation and is particularly difficult because of the government's lack of funds at the moment, but it could also lead to crowding out, whereby the deficit leads to higher interest rates as we borrow from the domestic sector, and that can lead to reduced spending as well. So there's a range of weaknesses that you can focus on there. If you do get asked to analyse a particular policy, I suggest you talk about income taxes and jot down all those things you can talk about. All right, with immigration policy, if you get a question on immigration policy, there are key things you want to be able to do, and this is something that people really struggle with in the CPAP exam, linking it to participation and unemployment. So if you do get a question on immigration policy and what our current immigration policy is, focus on permanent migration. So talk about how the fact that Australia has a skilled occupation list, and that occupation list allows people to come here in areas where we have legitimate skill shortages. The number of professions on that list is continuing to go down because of a lack of skill shortages in the economy. In terms of participation, there's really key words you want to use. So the fact that most of these migrants are skilled means they come here to essentially be part of the labour force. They're mainly in that age bracket of 20 to 40, and most of them are working. That increases participation. Define what that means and explain that because the numerator technically and the denominator go up by the same amount, because they're in the labour force and they're over 15, that will cause the ratio as a whole to increase. So try and link it back to a really key, clear understanding of what participation is. In terms of unemployment, it can lead to more unemployment in the short term because there's more competition for jobs. They can keep wage pressures down, but it can also lead to more job losses. It can also lead to a lack of incentive to train Australian workers. So that's a key weakness of migration policy. But if you are getting a longer question on unemployment, most of the benefits are there are benefits for unemployment. So the key thing is that immigration increases the quality of human capital. They bring skills here, which increases our productivity. They increase the quantity of human capital as well, which boosts competition for jobs. So that increased competition for jobs helps to boost productivity and helps to reduce wage pressures. Both of these things keep production costs down, which make firms more willing to supply. And what I mean by that is that firms will work longer periods. They might work 6 days a week because now it's costing them less to hire labour. That creates jobs. This, in combination with increased international competitiveness, because we've got lower prices, can both work to stimulate employment. Make it really clear the benefits for these policies and link it really clearly to growth and employment and all these benefits that stem from the supply side element, Key things, always talk about wages, always talk about productivity, always talk about them bringing new skills to the community. In terms of other supply side policies, and most of the things in this video is going to be related to supply, when you're doing welfare reform questions, in the past we've talked a lot about job compliance. My suggestion to you, and it's a big suggestion, is that it may be easy to talk about, you can talk about job compliance, but maybe do it in accordance with other welfare policies. So if it's just a general question about how welfare reforms can be used, use policies that perhaps is easier to link to participation. Okay, my suggestion is if the question says participation in it with welfare reforms, you focus on things other than job compliance, because job compliance can be a little bit tricky because it's mainly focusing on unemployed people and getting them to work, look for work more actively. So my suggestion, welfare reform questions, here are a couple of policies that you can use if it's about participation. The first one is the crackdown on the disability support pension. Okay, under the Gillard government, and it's continued recently, they put policies in place where a person must prove they have a permanent disability that prevents them from working more than 15 hours a week. So they've stepped in and said too many people are claiming disability support that don't really need it. We want only people that have a permanent disability that prevents them from working from claiming this disability support pension. So during the GFC, too many people moved onto the disability support pension, nearly 90,000. And since in the last couple of years, they've tried to limit that amount significantly, so only people that legitimately deserve disability support pension are receiving it. Those who fail to qualify will essentially have to be forced to be part of the labour force and start looking for work. Now, the fact is most of these people would be unemployed, but at least this saves the government money because on the disability support pension, they get around $815 a fortnight. They would at least move to the lower New Start, which would be about $540 a fortnight. So by cracking down on disability support pensions, the idea is that these people with some disability, but perhaps not one that prevents them from working, have to force to go back into the labour force, start looking for work. That increases competition for jobs, reduces wage pressures, could boost productivity. The key things you can link it to for welfare reforms and the goals. Other policies that increase participation, reducing pensions to parents once their children turn school age, that should just be welfare more generally, and raising the pension age could be talked about as other policies in accordance with this disability support crackdown and the job compliance. So if it's a question on participation, go to the disability support crackdown. I think it'll be easier for you. Other supply side policies, research and development. Again, an area from your last SAC that I think we can, if you sort of take a structure to your answers a bit better, you can answer in a lot more detail. So when you get questions on research and development and what the government is doing, focus on tax concessions first. So they give tax concessions to firms to allow them to inflate their expenditure and reduce their tax liability. They get to claim more tax than they actually spent, which means they can save money in terms of tax. Make it really clear what they do with that money. Don't just talk about healthcare. Okay, your answer won't get full marks if it's just about research and development into healthcare. It's not enough detail. It's not the main thing that we're focusing on with these questions. You need to talk about things that are related to capital. So we invest in robotics, artificial intelligence, new production methods, key things they can spend the money on, which will boost overall productivity. So make it really clear what they spend the money on. Then talk about the links to productivity. So the idea is that these new initiatives allow us to generate more output per unit of input or use our resources more efficiently. You can talk about how it creates a more dynamic workforce. It helps to lower firms' costs of production, and it makes them more responsive to consumers' needs. It makes us more adaptable, more up to date with sort of what society wants. When you're linking it to aggregate supply, this productivity improvements increases their willingness and ability to supply, particularly if they're investing in physical capital. And then link it to the goals more generally. So if it's a question on the goals, this talks about this willingness to supply. You can link it to lower prices. That leads to more willingness to supply, but also leads to increased international competitiveness, which keeps our prices down, creates jobs in Australia, which can then flow through to stimulate aggregate demand. They're the key things you want to talk about with this question. If it's a link to efficiency, this is something people struggle with. Define efficiency as maximising the overall welfare or living standards of society. And then key things you want to talk about there. One, lower prices. Pretty simplistic thing that research and development will do, which will improve people's living standards. Links to lower prices. A more dynamic workforce. Okay. Again, this sort of language will make you really stand out. They're ready to respond to consumers' needs, creates increased job opportunities, and helps to lower unemployment. They're all things you could link it to, particularly for allocative efficiency when you do these types of questions. If you need to pause the video here, drop them down. Make sure you've got really clear things for research and development. Education, another key policy. We've talked about a couple in terms of the Gonski. If it's just a general question about subsidies, talk about what schools will do with that money before you talk about the benefits for supply. So if we provide funding for universities or for schools, they could purchase new capital, more technological equipment, improve physical infrastructure, or they could invest that money in training for educators. So funding professional development, purchasing educational resources. Focus on what actually schools will do if they're provided with funds before you get into the benefits for boosting our supply potential. So really clear things: technological equipment, training, professional development for teachers, educational resources. That can be as simple as books and things like that. Okay, because you've got to remember, a lot of this funding is going towards disadvantaged schools. So it doesn't have to be high-tech equipment. It can be basic things that help to improve education, like access just to textbooks and things like that. This type of investment should result in better quality physical and human capital and improve educational outcomes, which will give us more skills in the future. When you're doing education questions, once you've made that link to what they'll spend the money on, and even Gonski, you can talk about general things they'll spend the money on. The key thing is it will boost quality because we get better skills, but also quantity. When you're linking it to quantity, talk about the fact that educated people are more likely to remain in the workforce. So those who are high school and college graduated or have apprenticeships, for example, are more likely to stay in the labour force, which helps to increase the overall quantity of resources. People are less likely to be discouraged when they have skills because they're more likely to be able to get a job. So education questions, link it to quality, and you can talk about more specifically that critical thinking and coding and all those skills we're trying to achieve with Gonski, but also link it to quantity because people are likely to remain in the workforce. Wage questions are likely to come up. Real wages are a really topical thing when the exam was written, so expect lots of questions on real wages. Make sure you can define real wages. So real wage growth has been really slow because nominal wages is growing just at a slightly faster rate than inflation, and it's pretty much been the same. So really there's been no real wage growth over the last few years. In terms of the monetary policy stance, you want to link that to both demand and supply. So if you get asked how real wages might impact the monetary policy stance, from a supply perspective, it's keeping costs of production down, which is reducing cost push inflation. From a demand perspective, there's slow growth in kind of national incomes and wages, which is keeping spending down, which is helping to prevent, so it's making sure that there's a lack of demand, which is keeping inflationary pressures down as well. So that's likely to lead to a more expansionary monetary policy stance, or at least allow the RBA to continue with their highly expansionary stance. So make sure you can link it from a demand and supply perspective to growth. From a demand perspective, it's a negative thing because wages aren't growing too very fast. From a supply, there are some benefits in the sense that it's keeping costs of production down and making firms more willing to supply. From a budget perspective, it's a negative thing, and that's mainly because the income taxes aren't growing at a very fast rate, and that's leading to a lack of income tax from the government. So in terms of anticipating a possible question, you might get asked what the causes of wage growth are and then have to link it to something. Link it to the monetary policy stance, or link it to the budget, or link it to growth. So that's how you go through the second part of the question. For the first part of the question, the main causes of a lack of wage growth, there's strong overseas pressures. So because we're in a globalized world, we've got to keep our wages down so we can compete with other entities. Otherwise, we'll just go broke. The high levels of underutilization, so supply of labour is exceeding demand. And then some really specific things. The high level of casual work is meaning that business is more flexible, which is keeping wage pressures down as well. And the lack of union membership, that's another key thing. Less people are protected by unions these days, which means that it's harder to fight for higher wages, particularly in low-skilled professions. So make sure you're aware or ready for a sequence of wage-type questions, and they're the kind of things you want to link it to that are causing it, and then be able to link it back to the goals. Other key things, you may get a question on factors impacting international competitiveness. Challenging dot point from the study guide. Make sure you're aware of particular things. And basically, when you get a question like this, really what you want to think about is how will this thing impact inflation and how will it impact net exports? That's how you link it to international competitiveness. So, for example, the company tax rates. Company tax rates should promote investment. They also lower firm production costs. So both of those things lead to lower prices because we invest in better technology and infrastructure and things like that. That should lead to an improvement in our international competitiveness. Slow productivity growth is a weakness because it can lead to higher costs per unit of output. Other things, droughts lead to a lack of resources available, so it reduces our ability to supply, leads to higher production costs for a range of businesses, and reduces our competitiveness. Trump's tariffs we'll talk about a little bit later, but it basically reduces demand for our exports because they have a tax put on them. The TWI, the lower it is as possible, the better, because we'll be more competitive and people will want our exports. And participation rates is another key one. More participation can lead to more competition for jobs and lower wage pressures, which makes us more competitive. So if you get general questions on factors impacting international competitiveness, they're your factors you could talk about. Maybe the lower company tax rates, participation, etc. Thank you.